Soldier finds his unconscious orc wife in battle. His brutal next move ended the war. There are moments in life when the world splits in two, before and after, whole and broken, alive and dead. For Bowen, that moment came on a battlefield that smelled like iron and regret, surrounded by bodies that used to be people with names, with families, with reasons to wake up in the morning. He'd been a soldier for 15 years, long enough to stop flinching at the sound of steel cutting through bone, long enough to forget that enemies had faces worth remembering, but not long enough to prepare him for this. He found her near the ridge, where the fighting had been thickest, where the ground was so soaked with blood it had turned into mud, and you couldn't tell which side was winning because everyone looked equally dead. She was face down in the dirt, green skin covered in gashes that still leaked crimson, her armor dented in places that made Bowen's stomach turn. Kralla, his wife, his secret. His entire reason for surviving this war long enough to see it end. He dropped to his knees so hard he felt something crack. Didn't matter. Pain was irrelevant. He rolled her over with hands that shook worse than they had on his first day of combat, and for 3 seconds, 3 eternal suffocating seconds, he believed she was just unconscious. That's what the title promised, right? Unconscious. Not dead, just hurt, just sleeping. Her eyes were open. That's the detail that broke him, not the wounds, not the blood, but the fact that her eyes, those fierce amber eyes that used to light up when she saw him, that used to narrow with challenge when she thought he was being too human, too soft, too careful, were staring at nothing, at everything, at a sky she could no longer see. Bowen made a sound he didn't recognize, something between a gasp and a scream, and a prayer to gods he'd stopped believing in around year 7 of this war. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no, come on. You don't get to do this. You don't." His voice cracked like ice under weight it was never meant to hold. "You promised we'd see the end of this together." But promises, he was learning, were things made by people who still believed the world was fair. Let me take you back, because this story, this tragedy dressed up as a war story, doesn't start on a battlefield. It starts 3 years earlier, with a soldier who was very good at hating and an orc who was very good at staying alive. Bowen had been fighting orcs since he was 23. 15 years of his life dedicated to a war he'd inherited from his father, who'd inherited it from his father, who'd probably inherited it from some ancestor so far back that no one remembered what they were actually fighting about anymore. That's how these things work. You don't need a good reason to keep killing. You just need inertia. He was good at it too. Not because he was particularly strong or particularly smart, but because he'd learned to stop seeing orcs as anything other than problems that needed solving. Obstacles. Threats. Things with green skin and big teeth that wanted to hurt the people he was paid to protect. It was easier that way, simpler. You can't lose sleep over killing monsters. And if you call something a monster long enough, eventually you stop checking if you were right. The border skirmish happened on a Tuesday, or maybe it was a Thursday. After a while, all the days started bleeding together like watercolors in rain. Bowen's unit had been sent to investigate orc movement near the Greystone Ridge. Routine patrol, nothing special, the kind of mission you did without thinking because you'd done it 100 times before. Except this time, the orcs were ready. The ambush was textbook perfect. They came from 3 sides at once, cutting off escape routes before Bowen's unit even realized they were surrounded. In 45 seconds, 8 men went from alive to dead. In another 30, that number became 12. Bowen fought like he always did, mechanical, efficient, empty. He didn't think. Thinking got you killed. You just moved, reacted, survived. His sword found orc flesh. Orc weapons found his armor. The dance continued until he tripped. Stupid, careless, deadly. He went down hard, helmet knocked off by a war club that would have taken his head if he'd been standing 3 inches to the left. His sword skittered away. An orc warrior loomed over him, axe raised, face twisted in the kind of expression Bowen had seen 1,000 times. Victory. The axe came down and stopped. Not because the orc changed his mind. But because another orc, female, covered in war paint that looked like lightning strikes across green skin, grabbed the warrior's arm and said something in their guttural language that made him hesitate. She was arguing with him about Bowen, about whether killing an unarmed human on the ground was worth doing. The warrior spat something back. She responded with what sounded like a command. They went back and forth for maybe 10 seconds. 10 seconds that Bowen spent staring up at them, confused, bleeding, wondering if he was about to die via orc politics instead of orc acts. Finally, the female orc won. The warrior lowered his weapon, looked at Bowen with something between disgust and disappointment, and walked away. She stayed. Bowen expected her to kill him herself. Some kind of honorable execution, probably, but she just stood there, looking at him with eyes that were calculating, curious, like she was trying to solve a puzzle she'd just noticed. "You fight without honor," she said in rough but understandable common. "All technique, no soul." Bowen blinked. Bowen. Of all the things he'd expected to hear in what were probably his last moments, literary criticism of his combat style wasn't on the list. "I fight to win," he managed. "No." She tilted her head. "You fight to not lose. Different thing." Then she turned and left, disappearing into the chaos of battle like she'd never been there at all. When reinforcements finally arrived and drove the orcs back, Bowen was still lying there, trying to understand why he was alive, trying to process the fact that an orc, an enemy, a monster, a problem, had saved him for no reason he could identify. That night, in his tent, he realized he didn't even know her name. It bothered him more than it should have. The second time they met, it was Bowen's turn to make a choice. 3 weeks after the skirmish, during a prisoner exchange at the border, one of those uncomfortable truces where both sides pretended to be civilized for a few hours, he saw her again. She was part of the orc delegation, standing at the back with her arms crossed, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. Their eyes met across 50 feet of neutral ground. She didn't react, neither did he, but something passed between them. Recognition, acknowledgement. Something that felt dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with weapons. After the exchange ended and both sides started withdrawing, Bowen did something incredibly stupid. He circled around through the woods, moving fast and quiet the way scouts did, and positioned himself on the route the orcs would take back to their territory. He waited. She came alone, as he'd somehow known she would, walking with the confident stride of someone who'd survived too many fights to worry about ambushes. "I know you're there," she called out without stopping. "Human soldiers are loud, like baby birds demanding food." Bowen stepped out from behind a tree. "You saved my life." "Yes. Why?" She finally stopped walking, turned to face him. Up close she was not what he'd expected. Orcs were supposed to be hulking brutes, all muscle and rage and teeth. She was tall, yes, and built like a professional soldier, but there was something elegant about the way she moved, precise, controlled. "Because warrior who died on ground deserved better death," she said simply. "Axe to back of head while unarmed? Cowards kill, not honorable. So you let me live because of honor. I let you live because you fight like someone who has forgotten why he fights." Made me curious. Bowen had no idea what to say to that, so he said the first thing that came to mind. "I'm Bowen." The corner of her mouth twitched. Almost a smile. Almost. "Krala," she said. Then, after a pause, "Go home, Bowen. Before I remember, we are enemies." He should have listened, but he didn't, because over the next 6 months they kept finding each other. Small violations of the border, chance encounters that happened too often to be chance, conversations that lasted 5 minutes and somehow felt longer than entire battles. They talked about everything except the war, about what it was like to grow up in their respective cultures, about food, music, the kind of small details that make a person real instead of a concept. Bowen learned that orcs had poetry, actual poetry, war chants that told stories going back centuries, passed down through generations like the swords they carried. He learned that Krala's father had been a legendary warrior who died in single combat against a human champion, and she'd spent her entire life trying to live up to a legacy that was impossible to match. Kralla learned that humans were more complicated than she'd thought, that they didn't all want war, that Bowen had a younger brother who died in his first battle at 17, and he'd spent the last decade making sure no one in his unit died the same way. Somewhere along the line, meeting her stopped feeling dangerous and started feeling necessary. "This is wrong," she said one night, sitting across from him in a clearing that belonged to neither side. The forest at the border was neutral territory, or maybe it just hated both of them equally. "I know," Bowen replied. "We should stop. Probably." Neither of them moved. "Your people would call you traitor," Kralla said quietly. "Mine would call me oathbreaker." "Yeah, so why do I keep coming back?" Bowen looked at her, really looked, at the way firelight caught on her green skin, at the old scars that mapped a life of violence, at the way she held herself like someone who'd learned to take up exactly as much space as she needed, and not an inch more. "Because," he said slowly, "maybe we're both tired of being what everyone expects us to be." Kralla was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You are very stupid for a soldier." "Probably. I think I might be stupid too." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't poetry. But it was real. And in a world built on lies about who deserved to live and who deserved to die, real was worth more than gold. The marriage happened a year later in secret, in a cave that smelled like wet stone and possibilities. There was no priest. No witnesses except Bryn, Bowen's friend and the camp healer, who'd figured out his secret months ago and decided that love between enemies was less dangerous than the hate that fueled the war. She stood at the entrance, keeping watch, singing one of the old songs under her breath, while Bowen and Kralla spoke words that no church would recognize and no government would accept. They made their own vows, simple ones. "I choose you," Bowen said, "over everything I was taught, over everyone who says this is wrong. I choose you until I stop breathing." Kralla's response was more direct. "I will stand with you. I will fight beside you. I will not let this world take you while I still have breath to stop it." And then they exchanged the chains. Bowen had melted down the blade of his first sword, the one his father had given him when he joined the army, and reformed the iron into a delicate chain. Kralla had done the same with a bronze war bracelet that had belonged to her father, the legendary warrior she'd never quite lived up to. They'd spent weeks figuring out how to braid them together. Iron and bronze don't fuse, shouldn't touch. But they'd woven the metals through each other, link by link, until two impossible materials became one impossible object. "We keep them separated," Kralla had explained when they'd finished the work. "You wear my father's bronze, I wear your father's iron, so we carry each other's ghosts." It was the most romantic thing Bowen had ever heard. For 3 years, they lived in that impossible space between worlds. Bowen went to war during the day, came home to a woman who was technically his enemy at night. They stole hours together when they could, a few nights a month, maybe a week, if they got lucky with patrol schedules. It wasn't enough, but it was everything. "Do you think it will ever end?" Kralla asked him once, lying in the grass under stars that didn't care about borders or species. "The war? I don't know," Bowen admitted. "Probably not in our lifetime." "Then we are fools for loving like this." "Probably." She turned her head to look at him. "I do not regret being fool. Neither do I. But the thing about living a double life is that eventually something breaks. Either the world finds out or the world forces a choice. For Bowen and Kralla, it was the second one. The summons came on the same day for both of them. Warhawks on both sides had decided that the endless border skirmishes weren't good enough anymore. They wanted resolution, they wanted victory, they wanted a battle so big, so decisive, that one side would break and the other would win. They wanted blood, on a scale that would make the history books. Bowen got his orders from Commander Vaughn, who stood there polishing his sword for the 5th time that morning, his nervous ritual before combat, and explained that every soldier capable of holding a weapon was being called up. "This is it, Bowen," Vaughn said, not looking at him, just looking at the blade like it held answers. "We end this, one way or another." Kralla got similar orders from Chieftain Krug, the orc leader who never raised his voice but somehow made every word sound like a threat. She told Bowen about it that night, in their last meeting before the battle. "He says this is the final stand," she whispered, her hands tight on the bronze chain she wore around her neck. "That we crush the human army or die trying." Bowen stared at the iron chain he carried. Vaughn said the same thing, different words, same meaning. They sat in silence for a while. What was there to say? That they should run. Desert. Abandon their people and let everyone else fight while they hid. "I cannot leave my clan," Krala finally said. "Cannot abandon them to die while I run. I can't abandon my unit either. So we fight. On opposite sides." "Yes." Bowen felt something crack inside his chest. What if we meet out there?" Krala's laugh was bitter. "Then one of us dies, I think. Or both. No good answer to that question, husband. We could aim to miss. In middle of battle, surrounded by hundreds who watch?" She shook her head. "No, we fight as we must. If we meet—" She didn't finish. Didn't need to. Bowen pulled her close. She let him. They held each other like drowning people clinging to wreckage, knowing it wouldn't save them but needing the contact anyway. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I know." She pulled back enough to look at him. "After battle, when it ends, we find each other." Yes. It was a lie. They both knew it was a lie, but sometimes lies are the only thing that make reality bearable. They separated the chains one last time. Bowen tucked the bronze links inside his armor, right over his heart. Krala did the same with the iron. When they left that clearing, they walked in opposite directions. Neither looked back. The battle was everything the Warhawks had promised. Thousands of soldiers crashing into each other like waves against rocks, everyone so committed to killing that no one stopped to ask why. It lasted from dawn until the sun started sinking. Bowen fought mechanically, the way he always had. Except this time every orc face he saw made him wonder if it was someone Krala knew. Someone she'd grown up with, someone who mattered to her. Killing had always been easy, now it felt like betrayal. He lost track of time somewhere around the 3rd hour, lost track of his unit around the 4th. By the time the sun started setting, he was just another body in the chaos, trying to stay alive 1 minute at a time. That's when he saw her. Not alive, not fighting, just lying there near the ridge in a way that made his blood turn to ice. He ran, forgot about the battle, forgot about the war, forgot about everything except the need to get to her, to prove his eyes were lying, to fix whatever was broken. He dropped beside her, rolled her over, saw her eyes, open, empty, gone. The sound he made brought the battle to a stop. Not all of it. You can't pause thousands of soldiers mid-swing, but the area around him went quiet, humans and orcs alike, momentarily distracted by the sight of a soldier cradling an enemy warrior like she was made of glass. Bowen didn't notice. He was too busy trying to understand how the world could keep existing when Krala didn't. His hands found the chain around her neck, the iron. His father's iron, still warm from her skin. He reached inside his own armor, pulled out the bronze, held them both, the two pieces that had been separated for 3 years, never meant to be whole except in secret. He braided them back together with shaking fingers, wound them around her neck and his, linking them one last time. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." But sorry doesn't bring people back. He looked up. Through the haze of grief and smoke and exhaustion, he saw something that made everything suddenly, terribly clear. Chieftain Krug, standing on a hill maybe 200 yards away, surrounded by his personal guard, directing the battle with quiet commands and gestures. The orc leader who'd sent Krala to die, who'd sent hundreds to die. Who would keep sending them until there was no one left to send? And Bowen realized something that would define the rest of his life. The war wouldn't end because one side won. It would end when someone broke the machine that kept it running. He stood up, took the braided chain off Krala's neck and left it on her chest, links of iron and bronze resting where her heart had stopped. Then he picked up his sword with hands that had stopped shaking. Everyone was watching now, humans confused, orcs uncertain. The battle had paused, without anyone giving the order, everyone trying to understand what they were seeing. Bowen started walking toward Krug, not running, not charging, just walking one step at a time, like a man who'd already died and was just waiting for his body to figure it out. "Bowen!" Commander Vaughan's voice, distant, irrelevant. "Stand down! That's an order!" He kept walking. Orcs tried to stop him. 3 of them formed a line, weapons ready. Bowen cut through them without slowing, not because he was particularly skilled, but because he'd stopped caring about living, and men who don't fear death are terrifying to fight. More tried, more died. Not quickly, not honorably, but inevitably. By the time Bowen reached the hill, Krug's guards were all on the ground, and the chieftain himself was standing alone, watching this blood-soaked human approach with eyes that showed something new. Fear. "You killed her," Bowen said. His voice sounded wrong, too calm, too empty. "You sent her to die for nothing." Krug didn't answer, but he raised his weapon, a massive war axe that had ended dozens of lives, and prepared for what he knew was coming. They fought for maybe 30 seconds. That's all it took. Krug was a warrior. Bowen was a ghost piloting a body that no longer cared about surviving. There's no technique that beats that. When it was over, when Chieftain Krug was on the ground with Bowen's sword through his chest, the entire battlefield went silent. Not because everyone saw. Most couldn't see through the smoke and bodies. But somehow, they knew. The way you know when a storm breaks, when seasons change, when something fundamental shifts in the world. The orcs saw their leader fall, and without Krug's quiet commands, without his presence directing the chaos, they faltered, stopped, began retreating, not because they were beaten, but because the structure that held them together had collapsed. The humans saw an orc army withdrawing, saw victory, started cheering. Bowen heard none of it. He walked back to where Krala's body lay, dropped to his knees beside her, and gathered her into his arms for the last time. That's where Bryn found him 20 minutes later, still holding his wife, while the battlefield emptied around them. "Bowen," she said gently, "we have to go." "I killed him," Bowen said to no one in particular. "I ended the war." "You did? Does that make me a hero?" Bryn was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I don't know. Does it make you feel like one?" Bowen looked down at Krala's face, at the scars from a lifetime of violence, at the peaceful expression that didn't match the brutal way she died. "No," he whispered. "It makes me feel like a widower. They buried her that night, in the clearing where they'd gotten married. It was illegal, dangerous, impossible. Bowen didn't care. He'd already violated every law and loyalty that mattered. One more wouldn't change anything. Bryn helped him dig, sang her songs while they worked, didn't ask questions when Bowen placed the braided chain, iron and bronze eternally linked, in the grave beside his wife. "She wore your father's metal," Bryn said softly. "You wore hers. That's a beautiful gesture." "It was all we had," Bowen replied. "2 ghosts woven together. Now she can carry them both." The war officially ended 3 days later. Treaties were signed, borders were established. Both sides claimed victory because admitting you'd wasted 100 years of lives for nothing was too painful to consider. Bowen was called a hero, given medals, promoted. People wrote songs about the soldier who'd ended the war with a single decisive action. He hated every second of it, because they didn't understand, couldn't understand. They thought he'd killed Krug for tactics, for strategy, for his people. They never asked about the orc woman he'd been holding, never questioned why a soldier would cradle an enemy like that. Never wondered if maybe, just maybe, the war had been built on lies from the start. 6 months after the battle, Bowen retired, gave up his medals, walked away from the praise and the glory and the life he'd built. He bought a small house near the border, close enough to the clearing that he could visit when the nightmares got too bad. People asked him sometimes why he'd done it, why he'd given up everything. He never told them the truth, that he'd killed a man not for victory, but for grief, that the war had ended not because anyone won, but because he'd been too broken to let it continue, that sometimes the bravest thing a warrior can do is stop fighting. 10 years passed. The border became less of a border. Humans and orcs started trading, cautiously, skeptically, but trading nonetheless. A few even started talking, sharing stories, realizing that maybe the people on the other side weren't so different after all. Bowen heard about it from Bryn, who visited once a month to make sure he was still alive. "There's a market now," she told him one afternoon. "Mixed, humans and orcs selling together. Can you believe it?" Bowen stared at his tea. Kralla would have liked that. She would have complained about it, though, said the humans were charging too much for bread, said the orcs were too proud to haggle properly. Bryn smiled. Probably. They sat in silence for a while. Then she asked the question she'd been building up to for months. "Do you regret it? Any of it?" Bowen thought about 3 years of stolen moments. About a love that should have been impossible. About a woman who taught him that enemies were just people on the wrong side of a line, drawn by people who'd been dead for centuries. About a chain made of iron and bronze, buried in a grave that no one knew existed. "No," he finally said, "I don't regret loving her. I regret that the world made it necessary to hide." "The world's changing," Bryn offered. "Slowly, but it's changing. Too slow, too late, but, yeah." He took a sip of tea. It was cold. He drank it anyway. "You know what the worst part is?" he asked. "What?" "I ended a war, saved thousands of lives, became a hero. And none of it mattered, because the one person I wanted to save is still dead." Bryn reached across the table, took his hand. "Bowen, you did what you could with what you had. That's all anyone can do. Is it enough? I don't know, but it's something." Years kept passing. The border kept opening. Children who'd grown up during the war had children of their own. Children who thought the idea of fighting orcs was as ridiculous as fighting the ocean. Why would you do that? They're just people. But Bowen stayed in his house, stayed close to the clearing, visited the grave when the anniversary came around. He never remarried, never wanted to. You only get one impossible love in a lifetime. Using it up seemed greedy. On the 20th anniversary of the battle, Bowen made the walk to the clearing one last time. His knees hurt, his back hurt. Everything hurt, really. 58 years old and feeling twice that. He knelt beside the spot where Kralla rested. The grave was unmarked, but he knew exactly where it was. Could have found it blind. "Hey," he said to the ground. "It's me again." The forest didn't answer. It never did. "Things are different. Better, I think. Humans and orcs trade now, some even married. Can you believe that? Took 20 years, but we finally caught up to us." He traced patterns in the dirt. "I still miss you. Every day, every hour. Thought it would get easier. They lied about that." A breeze moved through the trees. Bowen closed his eyes and pretended it was Kralla, telling him he was being dramatic, being too human, being soft. "I wonder sometimes what you'd think of me now. Old man, living alone, visiting a grave no one else knows exists. Probably call me fool." He smiled despite himself. "But you'd be wrong. Because loving you was the only smart thing I ever did, even if it hurt, even if it ended like this." He reached into his pocket, pulled out something small and worn. A piece of bronze chain, single link, the only piece he'd kept for himself. "I'm getting old, Kralla. Won't be long before I'm wherever you are. Hope that's okay. Hope you saved me a spot." He placed the bronze link on the grave, where the iron would be, completing something that had been broken for 2 decades. "Thank you," he whispered, "for teaching me that enemies are just people we haven't talked to yet, for showing me that love is braver than war, for being my impossible thing." He stood up slowly, bones creaking, soul tired. "See you soon, wife." Bowen walked away from the clearing for the last time, but he didn't feel sad. Not really, because somewhere, buried in a grave that no one knew existed, was a chain made of 2 metals that should never touch. Iron and bronze, human and orc, woven together by people who refused to let the world tell them what was impossible. And if that wasn't victory, Bowen didn't know what was. The war is over. The cost remains. Some battles are won on fields with swords and blood. Others are won in clearings with chains and choices. Bowen fought both kinds. He won both kinds. But victory and peace are different things. Victory is what you get when you defeat an enemy. Peace is what you build when you realize enemies were a lie all along. Bowen got victory. Krala paid for peace. And in the end, the world changed. Not because of generals or kings or grand strategies, but because one soldier loved one orc enough to break everything that kept them apart, including himself. Blood makes you human. Blood makes you orc. But love makes you something new, something the world isn't ready for, but desperately needs. That's the truth that died in Krala's arms and was born in Bowen's choice. Sometimes the most brutal thing a warrior can do isn't killing an enemy. It's refusing to see them as one in the first place. If you're still here, still listening, I need you to understand something. This story isn't about a hero who saved the day. It's about a man who lost everything and chose not to let that loss be meaningless. It's about Krala, who gave her life fighting for a people who never knew she'd tried to bridge two worlds. It's about Bryn, who kept a secret that could have gotten her killed because she believed love mattered more than sides. It's about every soldier who died believing the enemy was a monster, never knowing that monsters are just what we call people we're afraid to understand. The war ended, but the scars remain, on bodies, on land, on the collective memory of two peoples who wasted generations killing each other over lines drawn on maps by people who'd been dead for centuries. And somewhere, in a clearing that belongs to no kingdom, buried under dirt and leaves and time, there's a chain made of iron and bronze, still linked, still impossible, still proof that love doesn't need permission to exist, it just needs courage. If this story hit you somewhere deep, if Bowen's choice, Krala's sacrifice, or that damn chain made you feel something real, then I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button. Not for me. For every person scrolling right now who needs to hear a story about love being braver than hate. The algorithm doesn't care about hearts. It cares about engagement. And every like tells YouTube, this matters. Show this to more people. Drop a comment. Anything. Tell me what you felt. Tell me if you'd make Bowen's choice. Tell me about a time you had to choose between loyalty and love. Your words don't just feed the algorithm. They build a community of people who believe stories can change how we see the world. Because here's the truth. Stories like this, about impossible love, brutal choices, and the courage to be kind in a world built on violence, these stories don't go viral because they're easy. They spread because people like you decide they're worth sharing. Subscribe to Orcbound Tales if you want more stories that break your heart and rebuild it stronger. More tales of orcs and humans learning that the real enemy was never each other. More journeys that prove love doesn't need permission. It just needs courage. We're building something here. A place where fantasy meets raw emotion. Where green skin and human flesh don't define who deserves to be loved, where the bravest warriors are the ones who choose connection over conquest. And remember, the most powerful weapon isn't a sword, it's the willingness to see the person holding one. Until next time, warrior, this is Orcbound Tales, where impossible love becomes inevitable truth.